All right, gang. So we are now into taking a look at Mount Vernon from the standpoint of the trades that existed that helped to sustain life on the plantation and beyond. Um, and it's important that we understand that Mount Vernon is just one of a larger segment of what Washington owned in and around the area. And this map does a good job of depicting that, right? So just to orient you, um, this is the Potomac River here. And if you notice here that Washington, this is the what they call the Mansion House farm right there, right? So this would have been Mount Vernon, and that's just one of the farms. If we look at some of the other farms he has, River Farm over here, Muddy Hole, Dogue Run River. I'm sorry, Dogue Run Farm here, and then Union Farm here, all being run by Washington. So when we look at that past little graphic of the slaves that were employed, right, we can see just how expansive a property it was. So there is a lot that needs to be done in order to maintain these areas, right? And so the main source of income from Washington, from Mount Vernon, really from the 1750s and 1760s was, as many farms in Virginia was tobacco. And tobacco was the cash crop that we can trace all the way back to Jamestown and how that became the crop that sort of saved Jamestown. But the problem with tobacco is that it is extremely harsh on the soil. And so eventually, after a number of seasons of growing tobacco, the soil that it's being grown in is robbed of any type of nutrients that will allow it to continue to grow. So you'll eventually sort of dry out the soil. And so Washington decides that he is going to turn away from tobacco. The other problem that Washington had, and part of the reason why he turns to grain, was because the tobacco, really the main source of supply for tobacco was overseas in England. And once Washington sent that tobacco on its way, he was really at the mercy of his purchasing and selling agents in England, of getting a fair price for him for the tobacco, and getting it back to him. And a lot of times, you're also at the risk of losing all of your tobacco if the ship goes down at sea, right? And so there is a lot of the economy, the economics of it, that is out of your hands if you're a farmer, and your main source of supply is really in England. So the one thing that was attractive about turning to grain is that it was less harsh on the soil, but also it could be sold domestically, and there was a supply for it. So he could have more control over how much he was going to get for it, and all of those factors that go into it, right? So he becomes a grain farmer. And what's interesting is, because he becomes a grain farmer, that will sort of eventually turn into his role as a whiskey distiller, which is going to be an interesting thing to take a look at as well. But Washington was very much into the innovative nature of his farming practices, including what you see here, crop rotations, allowing some fields to lay fallow for a season so that they could replenish the soils, right? He was frequently looking at different sources of fertilizers, right? Always on the cutting edge of equipment. And I'm going to show you a link here into, we talked a little bit about it earlier, but it's an innovative idea of wheat treading. And it's a use of a 16-sided barn. So there's about a 2-minute video that I'm going to show you, or I have for you, which talks about that, so you can get an idea of the innovative nature of Washington's use of equipment too, right? Other trades that existed as well on the property were weaving, and I've got another video that I'll link to you there, another 2 or 3 minute video to take a look at how weaving was accomplished and its practice on Mount Vernon. Sheep shearing, blacksmith was not only a trade, but it's one of the trades that's closest to the house, which indicates its importance, right? There were stables that were held there as well. So there's a lot being done at Mount Vernon, okay? And then another example of Washington as a grain farmer is the use of a gristmill. And this is the gristmill and the distillery are about, I would say, what, 5 minutes away from the main property, so it's a little bit of a drive. But you can go down there and visit them. It's a fascinating look because the gristmill is still functioning. And I've included a link here where they'll go through the step-by-step process of how the wheat can be ground down into flour. Okay, so you'll get a chance to see that as it makes its way over this multi-floor building powered by a water wheel, which is really interesting to see. So I'll link that in there as well. And then of course there was the distillery, and I'll link a video here as well because I think the videos are probably the most effective way of showing you how these trades are done. And it's interesting that Washington was reluctant, and it's obviously late in his life, and he's really not interested in opening up a new industry. But he has this manager, he's a Scotsman by the name of James Anderson, who's Scottish, so he's very schooled in the ways of whiskey. And Washington becomes one of the largest distillers in the country, and yes, he did pay his tax, right? That's a mention of his role as president when he puts down the rebellion in Western Pennsylvania of farmers who didn't want to pay the tax on whiskey. Washington does do that. So I'll link that in there as well. So let's take a look at these trades. So take a moment now and visit and look at each of these links that I have so that we can learn a little bit more about the trades. And then we'll wrap up with thinking about the legacy. And I've got another video for you to watch there as well. So let's go ahead and take a look at that, and we will meet back to talk about the legacy.